the sister conference of Web Summit in New Orleans. In an era of clickbait and bias, should we place our faith in the old residents of the Fourth Estate? In conversation with Mike Issikoff from Yahoo News, please join me in welcoming Quentin Hardy, head of editorial for Google Cloud, Chris Duncan, managing director of The Times and Sunday Times, Joe Pounder, president of the Definers Public Affairs, and Darnell Strom from Creative Artists Agency. Please give them a warm welcome.
Okay.
Showtime.
It's showtime. Okay. Well, good to be here. I suppose, look, the title of this panel seems about as relevant as any in this entire summit. Why should we trust the established media? As somebody who's been in the established media for my entire career, I find this to be a challenging, increasingly challenging question. We're going to let everybody weigh in on various aspects of it. But I think just to start, let's have our panelists introduce themselves so you all know who's speaking and what their level of expertise is to speak to this.
Great. Good morning. My name is Darnell Strom. I'm an agent at Creative Artists Agency, which is one of the leading, entertainment and media agencies in the world. So we are representing a number of, actors, musicians, athletes, but we also represent a number of journalists and media personalities. And one of my areas of focus is in the news space, so working with some leading names in the media and journalism field.
Joe Pounder, president of Definers Public Affairs. We are a research and consulting company for tech companies, other industries on how to face their public affairs challenges. My background is I've been doing communications and opposition research in the Republican Party for over a decade.
A relevant question, a relevant subject these days, yes, which we'll get to.
Hi, I'm Chris Duncan. I'm the managing director of The Times, or here The Times of London. One of the world's oldest newspapers on the business side, so working out how to navigate publishers through the current disruption.
And I'm Quentin Hardy. I'm a third-generation journalist. One of my grandfathers owned a paper that shut in 2 years. The other one was the AP congressional correspondent. My father was the publisher of Life magazine. My mother did newsletters. I started at the Wall Street Journal. I was at Forbes. I did a weekly show on Fox. I was at the New York Times. And last February, I joined Google as the head of editorial inside Google Cloud. For those who don't know, Google Cloud is, well, they take Google's arguably the world's largest computer system, something that carries a third of the internet, and expose the software and hardware to companies to rent, much like AWS or Microsoft Azure or numerous other public clouds. My job is to essentially do analytic journalism from within Google now and try and explain this phenomenon to as many people as I can, as analytically as I can.
Well, Quentin, let's start with you because Google is clearly the behemoth in this space right now.
Yeah.
And it's taking quite a bit of heat because let's just start with, and I know this may not be your direct responsibility, but as the Google guy here,
but it's coming anyway. So.
It's going to come. Google News is often how people get their news these days.
I thought it was Yahoo News, Mike.
Yeah, well, Yahoo sometimes, but Google certainly is a big chunk of it. And it's always been a mystery to me, and I think a lot of other people, how Google decides, if it actually does decide, what shows up on that Google News page when you turn to it in the morning. We understand there are algorithms at work, but it's never been clear. So why don't you clear it up for us?
Well, I'd like to say I would if I could, but I can't. But I'm not sure I would. Well, I'm not a spokesman for Google here, and I don't work in that side of the business, so I have no exposure in it. So you could ask somebody in this audience and you'd have as ready an answer as I do. But the question in the panel is, how should we trust established media? And I do have some strong opinions about that. I mean, established media is basically a three-legged stool, traditional media. Going back to my grandfather, there was immediacy, what's breaking stuff, and you broke plenty of stuff, still do, I'm sure. There is authority, can we trust this? And then there is context. It is basically those three things people turn to. How does this locate in my world? Can I believe this is true? And, is this happening right now? Velocity. And there are various business models that weigh certain parts of that. The velocity part of it's really been what's been killed for many people, because breaking stuff travels immeasurably and gets repeated, frequently through search or by somebody else aggregating it or something like that. However, in that velocity environment, which has become so much more so, the other two, authority and context, have become much more valuable for those companies that can do that well, like the New York Times with subscriptions, like Yahoo News hiring somebody like you. So I think the model itself is changing. I know I didn't answer how does Google service the question, because I can't. But if you want to tweak it another way, I'll take it.
Well, yeah, no. But I do want to make the point, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that Google has never really explained this process. They use algorithms that are their own secret corporate property, and so they are in a way deciding what people see as news every morning, but they don't tell people how they are making that editorial decision, if it's even an editorial decision.
Well, for start, they don't. The language is broken here, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple days when I talk to Joe. But when you talk about Google News, I think people immediately have in mind all the journalists working for Google. Google just doesn't have, you're a reporter inside Yahoo. They don't have that job in Google. They're surfacing other people's stuff. And your issue is, how do they surface other people's stuff?
Right.
Like I say, I don't know. They don't reveal the search algorithms anywhere else either. And one reason for that was people would game it very readily. They'd figure out the algorithm and then exploit it and put up bad stuff. And typically, if you look at the roots of it, the kind of stuff I reported on, I know nothing new from when I reported, but it had to do with recency and popularity and authority. It was a cataloging mechanism for all sorts of internet search. I would assume those principles go into any kind of search model.
Chris?
I take a slightly different view of that. I think the view about subscriptions is interesting. I think for many years, Google News was very much tied to Google's first click free policy. So what it preferenced was news that was fast and news that was free. And if you were a subscriptions business, and at the Times we've been a subscription business since 2010, you dropped out of search entirely because Google would not index subscription content. Right. So Google News effectively reflects the ecosystem that is most rewarded by Google's advertising businesses. Most rewards free, high velocity, high volume, high viral news. And that's what ends up. There is no editorial policy. I think I'd agree with that, because there is no filtering mechanism by human editors to decide what is.
So is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's definitely a thing.
And we don't know if there's. I don't know if there's a filtering mechanism of human editors. Do you?
I don't believe there is. I don't believe.
We don't
know. The reason this is very relevant right now is we have this phenomenon of fake news that is really a sinister one, and we are learning more and more about how it is infiltrating our news feeds wherever we are getting them, and delivering either state propaganda or just sheer nastiness to people. And it's a huge issue as to how to filter that out. So it's obviously become a big issue in the United States because of what happened in the election. But Chris, just sticking with you for a moment, how have you experienced it in the UK, and how are you dealing with it?
So I guess the first thing around propaganda, state propaganda, in insidious news has been around for hundreds of years. The big change over the last 20 years is the separation of production from distribution. So for years, the Times has produced verified, published stories, but they owned both the selection of the stories and the means of distribution. The growth of the platforms, which we've all benefited from in terms of growing our audiences, has slightly separated that. So there are now other methods of getting distribution alongside the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Times of London. The BBC, particularly in the UK, is the biggest publisher of online news, but sits next to a guy in his bedroom who can get on the same distribution platform, and if they understand how the algorithms work, can achieve virality, scale, reach, a highly kind of targeted audiences, which has just never been possible before. So I guess in the UK you saw it. We're going to find out retrospectively that there was a lot going on in the EU referendum. I think we saw it in the elections across Europe. I think we're going to find out that, Russia today, not specifically to suggest it was anything to do with Russia, but they opened an office in Scotland 5 years ago in order to produce content that would spread around the country. I think it's a new threat, and I think in some ways established media has been a part of the growth of it, but now in some ways are one of the few places that can really query how it works and how this world of communication on new platforms is going to work.
Now, Joe and Darnell, you guys are both in the business of trying to influence the news of what we see. How has this evolving media landscape and the injection of fake news influenced the way you do your business? And I'll start with you, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, with the business that we do, being in the research business and putting together data points on political candidates, companies, and whatnot, like, we battle fake news every day. Because fake news is ultimately something that we are trying to fight against, because ultimately it discourages real news. We're sitting on verifiable, credible information, and all of a sudden we're dealing with a fake blog post that we've never seen before, or that might be the Russians or whatnot. So it's definitely a challenge for our industry. My ultimate solution to it is almost where I began in this business in 2004. When I began in 2004, the only way to get out a credible message from a political campaign or organization was to go to a reporter. They're the only ones who had the means of distribution to voters beyond paid TV ads. That's changed with Twitter and Facebook. Now, if I have a good video on someone, I can just tweet it out myself and talk to voters directly. But reporters still have credibility. The Washington Post, the New York Times, Maggie Haberman, Michael Issikoff still have brands and still have credibility. It means something to get on the front page. So I'd ultimately believe, like,
I'd say they're stronger now by virtue of fake news.
I totally agree.
Stronger.
Like, to defeat fake news, we actually have to have better real news. And I think what we're seeing at the Washington Post and the New York Times is actually really encouraging on that aspect, that people are signing up again, the traffic is up. And we're seeing stories, I don't know if it's unique to the Trump administration, but we're seeing stories that now have 12, 24, 36 different sources in them. I've never seen that before, and that's real credibility.
And I was going to jump in. I think in our business, so we're in the representation business. So we represent a number of media personalities. Some of them are on the opinion side, but I think what you're seeing more now is representing, reporters and journalists who worked at newspapers who used to not have agents before. And when you have these trusted names that are brands, how can we expose them to more platforms so we can reach more, so they can reach more and more people? And it is, if you're a writer like David Fahrenthold at the Washington Post, he was just at the Post. Now he has a cable news deal. Now, how do we get the book out? How do we find other ways to get his information distributed? Because these trusted names are very important, and we want to make sure that we are combating against the fake news.
But you're primarily in the entertainment business, correct?
CAA as a company, or
well, both. Yeah,
we are in the entertainment. We're not primary. Well, the business has kind of expanded so much. We're in everything from tech to media, but there is a big part of what we do that is in the news business, especially as it continues to grow.
Did you represent Harvey Weinstein?
No.
I don't know.
I think they're actually saying something.
No, well, the reason I bring that up, because I think it's actually a very relevant question today. I don't know how many of you have had a chance yet to look at this phenomenal story by Ronan Farrow in the New Yorker that just came out about how Harvey Weinstein intimidated the press by intimidating witnesses who wanted to come forward and tell their stories about what he did to them, but hired an army of private investigators and including former Israeli Mossad agents who posed as journalists in order to suck information out and use it to intimidate people who might come forward. Just as somebody who represents people in the entertainment business, what's your reaction when you read and hear something like that?
I mean, I think it's the reaction that everyone has. I don't think you have to be in the entertainment business to think that behavior is deplorable and disgusting. And Ronan, who we represented at the time when his first New Yorker article came out, again, it's people like that you want to get those voices out and speaking truth to power and finding people who are taking advantage of that power and exposing them, I think is necessary. So I'm glad to see it happen.
Right. I mean, but it is a big issue in the media right now as to why we are only just now learning the truth about a guy who has been accused of raping women for decades now. And where was the media, and why didn't we report on it before? And it's in part because of the army of publicists, lawyers, and others who he has been able to deploy over the years to suppress the truth.
You
got something to say?
Well, this is the behavior of a monster. We can all agree on that. But I think it is interesting also that it got surface now, because J. Edgar Hoover did things like this. And, plenty of other Hollywood guys going back to Jack Warner and before did things perhaps not this far, but intimidation of political and entertainment figures. You can go back to the 1920s easily. What's astonishing is how rapidly this one got surfaced once the Times started to crack it.
Yep.
And that's really unprecedented. That's the new thing here, that so many voices could come forward and be aggregated, if you will, with this hashtag #MeToo, and just causing this cascade that's shaping society as we watch it.
Right.
The positive effect is the new thing as much as the evil, predatory behavior of powerful men.
Right.
I think your point, and you'll know this from being in newsrooms yourself, there are lots of stories that newsrooms know but don't know. They know, but they can't prove. They can't prove a public particularly in the UK with the libel laws in the UK.
Right.
You have to prove there is a story, it's verified, it's in the public interest, that you have people who'd be willing to stand up and testify at the point that you had to defend it in court. And so sometimes these stories can be, retrospectively widely known, but as a publisher of a newspaper where your authority stands behind knowing that story is going to stand up, sometimes it takes one sort of tipping point, and then the story, as you say, the story blows up. And nowadays, when it blows up faster than ever.
And I think to the established media point, I fundamentally believe it was important that it was the New York Times that broke that story. Having it on the front page of the Times, a brand with that credibility, but also the credibility to defend the sources. Right. Not identify the sources, let people speak on background. And I think that's where the established media has to recognize it has the leverage and the ability, and needs to double down, the ability to get someone to talk and protect that source.
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen successive administrations go after sources and publications defend those sources. You've seen people go to prison over it, either conservative or people that would label them as liberal reporters, conservative reporters, all protecting the sources. And you just think about the Washington Post. How long did they protect Deep Throat? For like 30 years? Like, I think that's fundamentally important, and that's why stories like this get the credibility
I
and
think that's a
expand
very
fast.
good point. But also, I think that the point about the Me Too phenomenon, the hashtag Me Too, and how the new media landscape, for all its faults and defects, can have a really positive impact in encouraging people to come out. Frankly, it's not something I had thought about until you just mentioned it.
It's not the first time it's happened. The Suharto regime fell in Indonesia in the late 90s because activists surfaced graft of the family in their town and then uploaded it to a central site, so that people could think, oh my God, it isn't just like my little corner of Sumatra. This family's everywhere on the island, taking, dipping its, collective hand. And that put people out on the streets. So this ability to sort of gather individual experiences and turn them into collective social experiences may be a very rich area for media in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a point where the established media needs to be better at, is finding these trends and find these movements at a point where they're hitting that crescendo so they can light it up. They're
And
usually
it's a strong
reactionary
chance
to
somebody will try and game this one too.
Right,
once they figure out this phenomenon, look out.
So how does that? How can you use that in your day-to-day work? You're trying to promote a brand, get a message out for your clients. How do you use the new media landscape to do that?
We want to make sure that our clients are as well resourced as possible. So if it's one, we were talking about the Washington Post earlier and how they've had a infusion of cash to help them be able to do their jobs better. They've beefed up their investigative reporting wing, which they didn't have the resources to be able to do before. And I think the more resources that you put towards that, you will see folks starting to find these movements and trends earlier on because they have the time to dive into it. What we're trying to do is use every form of media possible to be able to get a message out on behalf of our clients.
Give us an example.
So I'll give an example. So there is a client recently that is a trusted name in news, and we just made a deal with Siri, with Google Home, and with Alexa, where you can, and it will be announced soon, but you can go and say, give me this person's top news stories, Alexa. And they will read it off, right? So that's a new way of kind of distributing and using someone's brand name, having them curate news and information in a way that is trusted so that you're able to distribute it. So that is a new way of one of the things that we're trying to do.
Right. Joe, you're in the political world, and you were involved in the 2016 campaign. You were a Rubio guy, if I recall correctly. Didn't work out so well for you. But,
Chris Christie.
Did you start with Christie? Is that?
What's that? No.
When
just running
that's
into
right. Yes.
little New Hampshire.
Yeah. So how did it change? I mean, you were, first of all, did you see the Trump steamroll coming and how they were using social media to their advantage? Did you see that?
So I'll be candid and admit that many of the other campaigns did not really see it coming until the very end. My business partner is Matt Rhodes, who ran Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012. And he said there were candidates who rose and fell really quickly during the 2012 primary, Herman Cain, Newt Gingrich, and whatnot. But Mitt always secured more and more of the electorate. And while we were fighting Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, Marco, what we failed to see was that Donald Trump was locking in more of the electorate. So Marco had a really good Iowa finish, a really bad New Hampshire finish, really good South Carolina. But then we got to Nevada, which is a caucus state, where the polls going into Nevada showed that 75% of the electorate had decided more than a month out from the election. And those voters overwhelmingly went for Donald Trump. And he won by 20 points. So the race was almost locked into place by the time that we even got to focus on him from the Marco world. And for me, it was really a lesson learned about, I think in this new age of media, with all these platforms, with all these means of communication, like narratives take very long to form now. Impressions, you have to push out more and more content than ever before to get a trend line to set in against a candidate. When we really took on Donald Trump, it was literally a week before Super Tuesday where 15 states were voting. We were introducing new information to voters, and the closer you are to an election, the more voters and consumers are bound to say, I don't trust that. That's new. There's a reason why that's coming out now. It's biased. We really needed to start in July of 2015, but our focus was on fundraising, endorsements. Is Jeb going to lock up the establishment?
Running a traditional campaign.
It was very much a traditional campaign. Right. And they were, I will give the Trump guys credit, on social media. He ran a campaign that I think we are going to see more in 2020, 2024, which is talking directly to supporters.
And I think it's going to be fascinating to see how, and this is the same in the UK, the challenge of how you regulate political media on platforms where you don't have visibility of distribution. Right. So in the UK, if you want to book political media on TV, on radio, in press, you declare, you have the creative is declared and sort of submitted. The only media now that doesn't exist for is digital, and in some ways it's the most targetable media. Right. And I think that's going to be, it's one of those challenges. It sounds very simple to say we should just have the same transparency that you do in other media. It's incredibly difficult to think about as policymakers how that gets enforced. I think that's going to be.
By the way, I mean, I'm going to interview tomorrow here Brad Parscale, who was the social media director for the Trump campaign, and he has said we won the election on Facebook. That's how we got elected president. But
we're governing on Twitter.
Governing on Twitter and getting whipsawed in the process. But did you see that in Brexit in the UK? Were the Brexit forces using social media? In the way we saw it in the presidential.
I think very similar. I think there are a lot of connections between those campaigns. I think the understanding of almost emotional and instinctive appeals from one campaign and logical, rational from the other was very similar to the approach in the Remain and Leave camps. So a lot of the social media used by Leave was targeted at very local issues. It was targeted at immigration. It was targeted at literally almost very small areas who had a particular migrant problem of a particular nationality. The creative would be tailored to point that out. Right. Whereas the other campaign was much more broadcast, much more, this is a sensible decision to do exactly what we're doing now. I think you saw it in the most recent Labour-Conservative election. Very emotive, crafted and targeted creative in social.
Do you yet have, in 1 second, I'll be right with you, but do you yet have evidence in the UK of the same kind of foreign involvement we saw in the 2016 election?
I don't think it's as far as, I think it's actually coming. I don't think as yet you've got a definitive view of it, but it looks
the evidence is coming,
likely.
or we will be seeing it.
I think it looks increasingly likely that was the case, but I haven't seen a definitive statement of the extent. I mean, I think in the US it was 126 million people were reached by it. I don't have that number for the UK yet.
Right. You were going to say.
I think Joe and Chris collectively have really reset the question in an interesting way, which is, Trump communicated directly. We're going to see future campaigns that are very direct. And when you say direct, you don't mean reasoned arguments laying out some rational process. You don't mean like a 20-minute Barack Obama, straight. You mean something from the gut that goes into social media, which is what you're talking about in a highly emotional level.
I honestly believe campaigns in the future are going to be more like news programs. Like they're going to literally run segments talking directly to their voters and to the people that they're using data to target.
Right, but it's less on a here the rational basis for my policies, and that kind of starts to define what we mean by established media. I mean, you're at Yahoo News, but you'd probably call that established media, right? And what you do, and it has to do with fact-based. Rational argument versus highly emotional sustaining your worldview at all costs kind of media. Is that the division we're talking about here?
I mean, I think it changes the role of established media to be also to try and surface those campaigns. If we can't get the transparency in the media buy, then one of the jobs of established media is to try and say this is the actual campaign that's taking place. Not the photo calls that they want you to see, but this is actually what's happening. Right. And I think that will define the next set of elections.
And there's no way to police what goes on social media, what goes on Twitter. I mean, the companies are all taking a lot of heat right now. They all got reamed by Congress last week for not policing their platforms.
Right.
Because their default has always been, well, we're not in the censorship business. Yeah, but in this case, we had a foreign adversary infiltrating your platform and taking it over and communicating with people with no filter whatsoever.
So we work with a few of these companies. I think it's also a mindset, too. Like, for example, after the Nevada shooting, none of them really thought to think about what's a bump stock. Is there content on my platforms about bump stocks and guns like that? Right. Like, because they just have a very tech mindset. Their platforms are engaging these new roles. So they just don't have that political mindset yet, but I think they're going to quickly mature into that.
I think perhaps the patience with the approach of saying, hey, we're just a platform may have run its course.
Those days are over,
Yeah. So is that shaking things up at Google, Quentin?
I don't speak for Google. I don't know what Google is. That said,
is there turmoil inside Google right now?
Well, again,
at what happened and what's been revealed?
Not in my world. I'm in cloud. We're doing, we're in a different business and actually assisting people to aggregate, and compute at a high level and establish what facts are.
Right.
I can't speak for news. I don't speak for news. However, I'll circle back to what I said at the beginning and try to address the question if we can trust established media.
I'm sorry?
Traditional media, its velocity, what's new, its authenticity, and its authority. And the authority and authenticity that Yahoo News and the New York Times and the Washington Post sell, it becomes more valuable in a world where you're contending with highly emotional arguments that are firing people up. So I think, should we not trust it? I think it has a very healthy future on that level.
Right. Well, I started out by saying Google was the behemoth in this space, and I'm going to prove it right now because I've just been informed we're out of time, so you had the last word. Anyway, thanks a lot. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.